Magnus Archives is a podcast. It's a horror, it's a romance, it's a tragedy, it's an office comedy, it's everything you could ever dream of and your worst nightmare. So, part 1 was a bit of a drag, right? Like, had to introduce all these stuff and have all sorts of caveats and moral dichotomies. But I think, this is gonna be the fun one, okay? We're gonna play some clips from the show, and we're gonna do some philosophy, and we're gonna actually have a point at the end. Probably. Okay, let's go. My hair is gonna look different in every single take. Just gonna have to make do. In the previous video, we talked a lot about morality and justice. But the question of free will is essential to those discussions. Are the characters in the Magnus Archives free to make the choices they make? Because if they aren't, then we can't really make any moral statements about them. Are Jon and Martin free? Johnny said that question doesn't really have an answer, but I don't know. That sounds like a challenge to me. We would usually say a choice is free if there is nothing that limits or prevents a person from choosing either option. If someone is being convicted of a crime, we wouldn't say they chose to go to prison, they were forced to. In his lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty, philosopher Isaiah Berlin defined this concept as negative liberty, the freedom from interference by others. In the same way, we would say that Jon didn't choose to be kidnapped, and Martin didn't choose to be locked in his apartment for 2 weeks. But what about things that are a bit more nuanced, but arguably more significant? Let's look at Martin. Hiding from Prentice is a decision that had very clear and understandable motives. He was in danger, he was afraid, seemingly he didn't have any other option. If he didn't do it, he would have died. But what about, for example, lying on his CV and applying for the Magnus Institute? That wasn't a life or death decision. He seemingly would have been just fine if he didn't do it. In fact, considering he probably would have been better off. So it was his choice, right? There are a few other factors we need to take into consideration, though. Martin's mother was sick, and his father wasn't around, so there wasn't anyone but him to take care of her. To do so, he dropped out of school when he was 17, so he didn't have the formal education required for a lot of jobs. He was also very poor, so he couldn't afford to finance himself and his mother without a stable job. So, really, the only thing he could do is lie on his CV. I mean, he could technically abandon his mother or starve, but are those really options? Martin may have had negative liberty, but he didn't have positive liberty, which is the possession of the power and resources to act upon one's free will in the context of broader society. Lack of information is another thing that limits freedom of choice. If you weren't informed of all the consequences of the choice you need to make, then that choice doesn't reflect your actual desires. This is a problem that plagues our protagonists constantly. Sometimes this is born out of pure ignorance and false assumptions. For example, Jon's decision to destroy the web table at the end of season 2 was made on the assumption that doing so would hurt, not Sasha, when, in fact, it only made the situation worse by releasing it from the web's hold. But oftentimes, Jon and Martin are being deliberately manipulated or lied to, mainly by Elias/Jonah. Elias fed Jon statements to make him develop holding powers, forged the footage that would implicate him of the murder of Gertrude, and sent them all to life-risking missions to destroy rituals under the false pretenses that they would be saving the world, fully knowing it's completely unnecessary. It's not just Elias who does this. Peter, Helen, Jude, Annabelle, and others all participate in the manipulation of our protagonists, making sure they don't quite know what's going on till the very last second, keeping them ignorant and helpless. There are many ways in which ordinary forces and people, like in our world, limit the freedom of the characters in TMA. But this is a horror, and we're only just scratching the surface. There are forces in the Magnus universe which are uniquely designed to actively stop the characters from doing what they want. When they discover the Institute is actually dedicated to an entity of fear, they obviously want to quit, but are supernaturally prevented from doing so. And if they stay away from the Institute too long, it literally drains their life force or something. Jon becomes supernaturally addicted to eating people's traumas, and the web exists, like an actual eldritch power whose whole thing is control and manipulation. So it seems like our characters didn't really have any choice. But there is a surprising amount of complexity to all of these that the show explores. In season 4, Jon and Martin discover that there actually is a way to quit the Magnus Institute. By blinding yourself. This is something they consider for a short while before completely abandoning the idea. It isn't a very good choice, but it is a choice, and it's one that Melanie makes. So what does that say about Jon and Martin that they don't? Most of the later seasons' plot consists of the Archives crew constantly having to fend off the fear entities, especially Jon, who, throughout season 3, gets kidnapped no less than 4 times. Even the most significant event in the show, and that Jon has ever caused, wasn't by his own will. The end of the world was brought by Jon reading Jonah's statement, only the moment he started reading, he was supernaturally compelled to keep going. Besides physical threats and coercion, Jon also deals with some very interesting nuances with regards to his free will. He had an encounter with the web when he was very young, and it keeps being involved in his life throughout the series. As Jon's actions get more and more morally dubious, he begins to wonder whether those actions are his own or a result of web manipulation. The most interesting thing about the web is that we're not exactly sure how it works. Is it subtle manipulation? Is it outright mind control? Is it not doing anything at all and its power stems from just making you think it's up to something and getting you to panic? Or all of the above? This makes all the interactions the characters have with web avatar Annabelle very mysterious and tense. Both we and the characters never know whether she actually means what she says or if it's just manipulation, or if she just wants them to think it's a manipulation, or basically reverse psychology ad infinitum. The question of which actions were actually theirs or influenced by the web is left unanswered. Eventually, even the characters decide to just try not to think about it too much, as the paranoia that results won't help them and might even be exactly what the web wants. Another very interesting angle to Jon is the exploration of his powers and how closely they resemble real-world addiction. This is a very intentional parallel by the writers, as has been stated. In season 4, Jon begins to intentionally seek out people who've had supernatural encounters and make them tell him their stories. The effect these have on him isn't quite clear, but it seems there is some force driving him to take those statements. In trying to defend himself from the accusations of his colleagues, Jon posits that perhaps the web is controlling him, that it made him do it. Annabelle's statement in the next episode denies Jon this excuse. She claims that she may have pushed some little things in the right direction, but she mostly have just been watching. She still might be lying, of course, but this seems to be the consensus for both the characters and the audience. Annabelle's statement in 147 is in itself an exceedingly interesting analysis of the concept of free will.
Have you ever read War and Peace, Jon? I know. I had to read an extract from it for a literature class once, ended up reading the whole thing. Another life. It's not actually as boring as people say, and its central thesis is that the tiniest, most insignificant factors can control the destiny of the world. In his postscript, Tolstoy muses on the concept of free will, on whether or not he really believes in it. He ultimately decides that if all the millions upon millions of factors and influences that weigh upon our choices were fully and completely known, then all could be foreseen and predetermined. But, he argues, it is quite impossible for the human mind to comprehend even a fraction of these. And in that vast, dark space of ignorance lies free will. Isn't that marvelous, Jon? Free will is simply ignorance.
It is notable that she chooses this specific interpretation since it highlights the conflict between the two forces that influence John's life, the web and the beholding. It reminds us of a running theme regarding his character, the irony of him being an avatar of knowledge and sight and even gaining omnipotence, yet still remaining essentially ignorant. John's constant pursuit of knowledge is futile and doomed to fail because he believes in the concept of free will, which, as Annabelle and Tolstoy apparently claim, is inherently antithetical to this goal. This contradiction works to further drive John's fear and hatred of the web. As a man of science who wants there to be a clear explanation to everything, the idea that there is no way of knowing whether he's being controlled and by what, whether he even can know it, creates an extreme sense of dread and paranoia. And again, that paranoia might just be exactly what the web wants. Either way, John ends up falling into the web's trap. Even by the end of the series, when he's all-powerful and all-knowing, he still can't remember a single web-patterned lighter. It all happened exactly how the web wanted it. Or did it? Choices are very important tools in storytelling because a meaningful choice can tell us a lot about a character, about their values, what they're willing to do to uphold them, and what they're willing to give up on. But what guides the choices the characters make? How do writers decide which choice is right for which character? A lot of the time, a character is designed to have certain drives or desires. These can be explicit and conscious, but they can also be more subtle, abstract, or subconscious. This isn't exactly groundbreaking, but in the context of analyzing the free will of the characters, it raises some interesting questions. If a character made a choice due to an inner drive they had, is that choice free? Let's take a look at the motivations of the characters in the Magnus Archives and how they inform some of the most important moments in the series. Sasha James was an archival assistant, and her main appearance was in episode 26, in which she tells of her encounter with the distortion. Unlike Martin's encounter, which we heard a few episodes prior, where he was scared, trapped, and helpless nearly all of the time, Sasha seemed investigative and calculating. She herself is the instigator of almost all the events she experienced. She went after Michael twice and followed his instructions to go somewhere which will allegedly help her save her friends. She would have confronted him even sooner if she wasn't late for work. At the end of her statements, she comments on how weird their job is and that they should probably quit. When John asks her if she wants to, she replies,
"No, I'm just too damn curious, I suppose."
So, of course, in episode 39, when she thinks there's something dangerous in the room with her, instead of hiding or running away, she yells,
"Hello? I see you! Show yourself!"
Even when she's terrified, not sure whether her friends are alive or not, sitting in a room full of spooky objects which she herself once noted are probably supernatural, she's just too damn curious. The same goes with Tim. From the start of season 3, it becomes quite clear that Tim's main motivation is revenge. Revenge for his brother, for Sasha, revenge on the stranger. And it also becomes apparent quite early on to both the listeners and the characters that he is going to die pursuing that goal. To me, the question of free will is the most essential to the ending of the Magnus Archives. It all came down to that final choice, whether to trap the fears or let them go. And more specifically, it was about what John and Martin were going to do about it. As we've discussed in the previous video, they were the ones with agency, and their actions determined the fate of the universe. The most genius thing about the writing of that finale, in my opinion, is the way it was foreshadowed by the characters throughout the final season. The moment the choice is presented, it's very clear which each of our protagonists is going to support no matter what. Therefore, the way the events unfold seem almost inevitable? If I were to strip it down to the essentials, I would say that the unstoppable forces which led to this outcome are Jon's guilt and Martin's love for Jon. Character-wise, the main focus of the season was establishing Jon and Martin's relationship and affection, as well as Jon's immense sadness and grief about ending the world and his newfound power. While Jon is also very much in love with Martin, his negative feelings take a much higher priority in his mind. And while Martin also feels guilty about what happened, his much more optimistic and hopeful outlook allows him to be action and goal-oriented instead of wallowing in guilt like Jon. This comes into play most prominently in their Kill Bill arc, which makes up for a large part of the season. Jon's killing of Not Sasha is incredibly exciting to Martin. Finally, they have a way to fight back against hostile forces that have destroyed their home.
Whoa! What was that?
I destroyed it. Killed her.
Are you kidding me? You obliterated her! You smoked her!
Jon, on the other hand, can only focus on how unfair it is that he is so privileged in a world where so many suffer because of him.
Sure, okay. That's really not that complicated, Jon. I don't see why you were being so coy
Because
about it.
I'm ashamed, Martin.
Ashamed?
Yes! Ashamed of the fact that I destroyed the world and have been rewarded for it. The fact that I can walk safe through all this horror I've created like a fucking tourist, destroying whoever I please. The fact that I enjoyed it, and the fact that there are so many others that I still want to revenge myself on.
This dichotomy is finally verbalized by the characters in the promise that they make for each other in episode 191.
Martin, when the time comes, I need you to promise me that you won't try to stop me.
I promise. I love you, Jon.
I love you too.
But I'm not going to doom the world over it.
Thank you.
And you have to promise me that you're going to do everything in your power to live. That you're not going to sacrifice yourself at the first opportunity just because you feel guilty about what happened.
I promise.
And the most important and tragic bit of foreshadowing is that it is very clearly established what the absolutely worst, most terrifying thing would be to each character. What is the one thing that they never would or even could do?
So, this price. What do you think? Are we going to have to kill Jon? I don't know, because you don't know. But it seems like something we should at least consider. I have thought about it, and I won't. I don't think I could. I guess that's why it really bothers me, you know. I try, but I can't actually imagine ever making a decision that I knew meant losing you. And it hurts to know you can.
You didn't damn the world, Martin.
We all...
No, we all... Nothing. I'm the one who caused all of this. That's just the truth of it. I'm the one whose whole life has been nothing but one long setup to this.
Jon.
You didn't speak the words. You didn't feel them move through you, vomiting out of you like... I did this. It's my fault. And I don't want... I can't let anyone else feel that helpless, enormous guilt. Ever.
Hey, come here. We're going to fix it.
No. We're just going to pass it on.
And as we all know, they both broke their promises. Jon followed his guilt, Martin followed his heart, and eventually they both end up having to do the one thing they never wanted to. Martin had to kill Jon, and Jon had to let someone else feel that helpless, enormous guilt. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they both ended up somewhere else, alive, and the fears never caused another apocalypse. We'll never know. But the events that transpired in that faithful 200 episode couldn't have happened any other way. I do want to have a quick tangent about why Jon let Martin stab him in the end and free the fears, because I've seen many people not really get that move. I mean, if it was so important to him to not let the fears go, why did he change his mind at the last second? This did bother me for a while, and eventually I think I figured out an interpretation that I'm happy with. I think you can make the case that Jon was fine with the world he lives in being doomed as long as he had Martin. He essentially says so in 161.
It hurts.
I know.
I need time.
I know. But we can't stay in this cabin forever.
Why not? It's quiet here, and I have you.
And even after he kills Jonah and becomes the Eye's pupil, he tells Martin that they can still be together until it's over. But faced with the possibility of losing Martin forever, the world he had just doomed would be unacceptable for him. The small chance of maybe surviving and being with Martin is better than a world where he'll have to spend the rest of his life without him. So he trusts Martin with his life. He trusts that Martin made the right call, even if he doesn't agree, and even if they can't know that for sure. His love overcomes his guilt at the end. And that's what's so beautiful about the ending of the Magnus Archives. It's so tragic, so inevitable, and yet so full of love. Okay, back to free will. Sometimes when you've been deliberating on the agency of characters from a fictional podcast for over 3,000 words, you need to take a step back and ask yourself, why are you even doing this? I mean, these are characters, they're not actual people, they're not real, so of course they aren't free, right? Things that aren't real can't have free will, but this inevitably begs the question, are any of us real? A relevant dichotomy in metaphysics is the one between materialism and idealism. Materialism as in the philosophy, not as in I have lots of money that can buy stuff and that's cool. That's right, we're getting into the heavy stuff now. Materialism is the view that matter is the fundamental substance in nature, and all things, including mental states and consciousness, are results of material interactions. According to philosophical materialism, mind and consciousness are byproducts of material processes, such as the biochemistry of the human brain and the nervous system, without which they cannot exist. Idealism claims the exact opposite, that reality is indistinguishable and inseparable from human perception and understanding, and that reality is a mental construct and closely connected to ideas. Essentially, and this is an oversimplification, idealism holds that consciousness, the mind, is the origin of the material world, while materialism holds that the material world is the origin of consciousness. I think a lot of us at first glance would probably lean more heavily towards the side of materialism. I mean, things are real, right? And we can describe real things using science. Sure, we can't describe everything yet, but we shouldn't allow our ignorance to undermine the possibility of future explanations. This is the goal of science, to find a physical explanation for everything, and that includes mental states and consciousness. There are several responses to this view, but I want to bring up one that I personally find compelling: the knowledge argument, also known as Mary's Room or Mary the Super Scientist. Mary's Room is a philosophical thought experiment proposed by Frank Jackson. It was originally proposed as follows.
Mary is a brilliant scientist who is, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and use terms like red, blue, and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina, and exactly how this produces via the central nervous system the contraction of the vocal cords and expulsion of air from the lungs that results in the uttering of the sentence, "The sky is blue." What will happen when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a cold television monitor? Will she learn anything or not?
I think I would be hard-pressed to find anyone that would respond no. This thought experiment demonstrates our intuitive understanding that there are some mental experiences that can't be described by material interactions, that there is some knowledge that can only be attained through conscious experience. There are, of course, also criticisms of this stance. Even Jackson, the original creator of this argument against materialism, now believes materialism does have the more logical answer. But I do want to stick with Mary the super scientist because I believe in this argument, and it's gonna be quite useful for the actual point I'm trying to make. So, we've decided materialism isn't really our thing, since we believe there are some things that are consciousness alone. Mary's experiences of seeing color are different from knowing all the physical knowledge there is to know about it. So, what about idealism then? Well, it's true that Mary has had a mental experience, but that mental experience wouldn't have occurred if she wasn't exposed to a physical experience, actually seeing color. David Hume has a very good quote on this.
For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception.
Moreover, even if we can't point to any physical event in the brain and say that is this mental state and have the same knowledge as being in that mental state, we also recognize that the mental state couldn't have happened without the brain. So the mental state is distinct from the physical state, but it is inseparable from it and arguably dependent on it. Having the mental experience of seeing color requires the physical phenomena of both photons hitting your retinas and the brain firing neurons. If so, what is the mind? What is consciousness? What is the soul? Well, we could try to look at this problem from a dualistic perspective. Instead of trying to ascribe the nature of reality to just one thing, mental or physical states, we could argue that they are both separate and useful categories in describing our world. So, what about consciousness? Well, if we can't really separate the consciousness from the physical states, but we also have certain states that can only be described mentally and not physically, then the consciousness is simply a tool through which we experience and interpret the world. It's not real per se, but it doesn't not exist. It's not a thing, but it is something. It's the discovery of things. So the subject is dead. It's not real in the way we're used to thinking it is. But now we're left with the question of, if consciousness isn't real, then how can it have free will in any meaningful way? If the mind is just a tool, can we really say that we are more real and have more free will than the characters in the Magnus Archives? Let's throw all that metaphysics nonsense out the window for a sec and just assume that consciousness is real. Would that mean we do in fact have free will? Let's talk about fate. In Greek mythology, fate is any of three goddesses who determined human destinies. They were usually depicted as very old women. Their names were Spinner, Allottor, and Inflexible. Spinner spun the thread of human fate, Allottor dispensed it, and Inflexible cut the thread. The implication of this being, of course, that the path of one's life, their future, is predetermined. But if the future is predetermined, then free will cannot exist. The belief that whatever happens is either bound to or has been decreed to happen is called fatalism. The Magnus Archives specifically is very interesting to discuss through this lens because the ending of the Magnus Archives was actually predetermined in every sense of the word. A lot, if not most, shows just kind of start out from somewhere and go with the flow. But in TMA's case, the ending was one of the first things that were crafted. Some aspects of it changed, but the story was always headed, and very intentionally so, in the same direction. Another important figure in Greek mythology is the oracle. The oracle was a person you would go to for counsel in the form of prophecies. If the fates would determine your fate, the oracle would reveal it to you and guide you towards it. In a way, Jon is kind of an anti-oracle in the sense that he has almost infinite knowledge in his grasp, but it never seems to give him the insight he needs in order to know what the right thing to do is. If there is one piece of media that knows something about oracles, it's The Matrix Reloaded. One of the most important figures in the movie is the Oracle, a program that seems to be able to predict the future. In the movie, Neo has a sit-down with her where they discuss the nature of free will in a world where the future is known.
Candy?
You already know if I'm going to take it?
Wouldn't be much of an oracle if I didn't.
But if you already know, how can I make a choice?
Because you didn't come here to make the choice. You've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it.
It seems that the Oracle acknowledges that her prophecies do actually negate the concept of free will in the traditional sense. He didn't come here to make the choice. He can't do anything other than what he's meant to. But she still attributes the choice to him, not fate or God or code or any other external source. It seems like she's implying that because of who Neo is, his desires, experiences, connections, and everything else that influences the way he thinks, he will always come to the same conclusion about this decision, or any decision, no matter what. This philosophical view is called Determinism, and it is also explained in the very same movie by another character, the Merovingian.
You see, there is only one constant, one universal. It is the only real truth. Causality. Action, reaction, cause and effect.
Everything begins with choice.
No, wrong. Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those without.
Essentially, for every choice we make, there is a reason why we made it. And according to determinism, this means that the choice was predetermined, destined to happen the way it did because of all the factors that influenced it. In a deterministic universe, free will really is nothing but an illusion we believe in so that we would feel in control, when in fact, we never were. Our favorite web avatar, Annabelle, also expresses support for these ideas.
We all have forces that drive us, circumstances that direct us, and even if we choose to ignore these and act against all logic just to prove that we can, is that not simply allowing the existential terror of our own powerlessness to control us instead? Scans show decisions are made by your brain long before your conscious mind even has a chance to register them. Most of one's life is simply spent looking back and convincing yourself that you chose deliberately to act like you did.
So really, Jon and Martin can have positive liberty and negative liberty and whatever else, but that won't matter. You can't have free will when your will isn't actually yours to control. Now that we've realized how cosmically screwed we all are, both the characters in the Magnus Archives and the entire human race, what do we take from this? Well, when we say that a story or a character develops a life of their own, what do we mean? On the surface, it seems like kind of a nonsensical statement. The author writes the story, they're in control. The characters aren't actually living. When we're talking about TMA, we might say that the author isn't the sole contributor to the piece. Maybe what gives the story and characters lives of their own is the way the lines are acted and directed, the way the show is edited, the soundscaping, the audience's reaction to the text. Even the writing itself is affected by so many things other than solely the will of the author. Not unlike Jon and Martin, we ourselves are also influenced by countless tiny things every day. We are shaped by our experiences, our environment, our genetics, our relationships. Who are we? What is our personality, if not the sum total of all of those things? But does that mean that, as determinism claims, we don't have free will? That choice is an illusion? Maybe. If you happen to believe in the concepts of souls, you probably don't think so. Maybe for you it's a combination. You recognize some things that influence you, yet you still believe in the idea of free will. I think that even if free will doesn't actually exist, we kind of, even if subconsciously, have to believe it does. 'Cause otherwise we'll end up like...
Free will's an illusion, morality is too, so it's not my fault that my parents messed me up, 'cause their parents messed them up. And Adam and Eve were messed up by God, who was messed up originally by the Big Bang. Everything is the Big Bang's fault.
Or like...
Nothing matters.
And those perspectives don't really contribute to a happy and fulfilling life. Is that okay though? That we all believe something that can be so easily questioned? Is belief in free will substantially different from believing in God, or science, or that the universe even exists? At least it's one thing that almost all of us believe, and that's pretty rare, so I guess that in itself has value. So yeah, Johnny was probably right. Some questions can't really be answered. But they should still be discussed. Even if we can't calculate with absolute certainty the amount of free will we have, thinking about what affects and limits us is still a good thing. Being aware of the forces that control our lives is what will allow us to have more control of them. We can't ever know if Jon and Martin were free, but we can think about it. Evidently, I have. A lot. And I feel like that was useful. I have some new perspectives now, some new thoughts in my head that I didn't have before. And just because they aren't real doesn't mean they can't be meaningful. Woo! That's all I got. Good luck.